Welcome to the Savvy Commercial Real Estate Podcast, your resource for relevant, helpful, and immediately usable information regarding all things commercial real estate. Whether you are buying, selling, financing, exchanging, managing, or developing commercial real estate, rest assured you are in the right place. Savvy Commercial. Listen, apply, repeat.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining me at the Savvy Commercial Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Neil Sherman, coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona. And today, we are very, very honored and fortunate to have as our guest in the studio, Jim Miller. Jim Miller is an Executive Vice President and General Counsel for IPX 1031, a dedicated qualified intermediary for all types of 1031 tax-deferred exchanges. IPX 1031 is a subsidiary of Fidelity National Financial, Inc., which is a publicly traded company which owns 7 large title insurance companies. You've probably heard of all of them, Fidelity National Title, Chicago Title, etc. As a practicing attorney, Jim represents buyers, sellers, home builders, and developers in commercial and residential real estate transactions ranging from multi-million-dollar shopping centers to single-family homes. Mr. Miller received a Bachelor of Arts degree, magna cum laude, from the Pennsylvania State University and a Juris Doctorate from the Villanova University School of Law. He's a member of the Bar of the State of New York and a registered in-house counsel in the state of Arizona. Jim, thank you for joining us today. Good morning, or good afternoon, I should say.
Good afternoon, Neil. I'm happy to be with you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, and thanks for being our guest today. Jim, I'm just going to jump right into it. I like to say that you've forgotten more than most people know about 1031 exchanges. I really think that's true. So you're perfect to talk about 1031 exchanges today. What I'd like to ask you first is, for those people who are listening who might not know as much as other people, other listeners, regarding 1031 exchanges, could you just kind of set the stage a little bit? Tell us a little bit about the IRC Section 1031 tax-deferred exchange. Why should a commercial real estate investor take advantage of this provision?
Okay, sure. Basically, in a very, very simple format, a 1031 is about you have X number of dollars invested in a piece of real estate and you want to sell that. As long as you reinvest all of it, then you can fully defer taxes. If you partially cash out or fully cash out, then you're going to pay taxes. And it's important to remember these are tax deferred exchanges. So basically, what is happening is the form of the investment is being changed, but the dollars that are actually invested are staying in there, and that's why the Internal Revenue Code permits the tax deferral with regard to 1031.
So Jim, are you referring to equity dollars, debt dollars, or both? When I say debt dollars, I mean, of course, loan or financing dollars, or both?
Well, it basically probably the easiest way to think about it is we have in the industry what we call the napkin test, and that was put together by a number of attorneys who sat down in a coffee shop in San Francisco after the regulations came out in 1991, and they were trying to figure out how can we make it simple enough that we can explain it to our clients. And so they wrote down some basic rules. I guess what a napkin, that's how we get the word napkin test. But basically what happens if you think about it, what you want to do is if you have your sales price, your gross sales price, so that you subtract off the sales costs, so you get to your net sales price, you want to buy replacement property that's equal or greater in value. Okay. The second thing is you want to reinvest all of the equity that you had. So basically you want to spend all of the equity. And last thing you want to do is you want to replace the value of any debt that you had on the relinquished property. And it's important I emphasize the word value, because a lot of times taxpayers and even their advisors, attorneys, and accountants think that if you had debt on the relinquished property, you have to have debt on the replacement property. That's not true. What you have to do is you have to replace the value of the debt. So let me give you an example. Let's say that I have a $100,000 debt on my relinquished property. I want to sell it, and I need to replace what? I need to replace $100,000, the value of the debt that was paid off in the relinquished property. So I could really do that one of three ways. I could put a $100,000 loan on the replacement property. I could come in with $100,000 from outside of the exchange, or I could do a combination of both. Maybe I put a $50,000 loan on the property, and I come in with $50,000 from outside of the exchange. So that's what I mean by you need to replace the value of the debt that gets paid off.
So Jim, I have a question for you about that, because I bet that is one of the most commonly misunderstood concepts of a 1031 exchange is that you have to replace the debt. So in round numbers, if you had $1 million of equity and $500,000 in debt, could you pay cash? Could you pay $1.5 million cash for the next property and satisfy that the same way?
Yes, absolutely. Because in that situation, you would be replacing. When you paid off that $500,000 debt on the relinquished property, when you're coming in with $500,000 from outside of the exchange, and so you are replacing the value of that $500,000. So that's not a problem. That's why I try to emphasize you need to replace the value of the debt. Don't focus on you have to replace the debt. You have to replace the value of the debt.
Okay. And to the extent that any portion of the debt is not replaced, or any portion of the equity, I'm talking about from the property you're selling, is not replaced, then what happens? Let's say I don't know. Let's stick with that example. $1.5 million, $500,000 was in debt, $1 million was in equity. You buy the next property. I guess it doesn't matter how much was debt, how much was equity. If the next property is only $1.2 million, you have a $300,000 problem. Then is that correct?
You're going to have $300,000 in boot, and that $300,000 is either going to be cash boot if you didn't spend all of the $1 million of equity, or it's going to be mortgage boot if you didn't replace the value of the debt that you had on the relinquished property. So yes, you are going to have boot. Now, in applying the napkin test, basically, if you your situation, you're selling $1.5 million property, $1.5 million property, and buying a $1.2 million property, so you're buying down by $300,000. So that's a red flag that you're going to have boot. You're going to have, and that's going to be taxable. So basically, in your situation, you had $1.5 million tied up in the relinquished property, in the investment property, and then you replace that with a like-kind property that's worth $1.2 million. So you get to defer with regard to the $1.2 million, but you cashed out, you pulled profits to the extent of $300,000, you're going to pay taxes on that. So basically, what you did not reinvest is the $300,000. You're going to pay taxes on those, on the boot.
Okay, perfect, understood. If you said this, I must have missed it. But when you are doing your exchange, and you guys are an accommodator, right? Well, maybe we'll talk about that in a moment. But you guys are an accommodator, middleman, whatever you want to call it. Is there a rule about how many properties the seller of that property can identify for his next property, his or her next property?
Yes, there's two rules and there's one exception.
Okay.
The most common rule is the 3-property rule. And a lot of times when I'm talking to people about this, I say there's only one word that you need to focus on, the number 3. you can identify any three properties without regard to their fair market value. The second rule is called the 200% rule. So under the 200% rule, I can identify any number of replacement properties, but the catch is the total, the aggregate value of everything that I identify cannot exceed 200% or 2 times the value of my relinquished property. The third is the 95% exception. Sometimes that's called the 95% rule. And basically what that says is if I blow both the three property and the 200% rule, I can still save my exchange as long as I acquire 95% of the value of all the properties identified within 180 days. So think of the 95% exception kind of like as this all or nothing safety.
Okay. But it sounds like I'm taking some notes here actually, but it sounds like they'd be much better off doing one or two so they don't get stuck with the 95% rule. A or
Yes,
B is better
absolutely.
than C, it looks like.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Perfect. All right. Moving on. Jim, have there been any changes to these rules recently? You're a lawyer. I'm sure that you guys are as on top of these changes, proposed changes, et cetera, as anybody possibly can be. Just a quick aside, we just had the midterms earlier this week. We have a presidential election coming up in 2 years. What's on the agenda, if anything, either that's been there for some time or that you see coming down the pipe that could impact 1031 exchanges?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. And at this point, we're not quite sure. I was actually on a call, Government Affairs Committee call yesterday on this very topic. But basically, the last 2 years, President Biden has had a proposal in the budget to limit or cap Section 1031 gain at $500,000. And as you can imagine, and everybody who's listening can imagine, we consider that tantamount to repealing 1031.
Sure.
Because, but basically we have conducted, and when I say we, I'm talking about the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, which is our trade organization. We also are involved with the Real Estate Roundtable, and we have 35 coalition members, basically on the 1031 coalition, and all of us put things together and have studies conducted, macroeconomic and microeconomic studies conducted, and examples of members of those of the Real Estate Roundtable and the 1031 coalition. The NAR, the National Association of Realtors, NAREIT's a member. There's a lot of associations that are involved in real estate, obviously, but we also have a lot of organizations. And over the years, this coalition was started to be built back in 2016. And so we've been very active. Last year, we conducted over 33. We conducted, in the last 3 years, we've conducted over 60 Zoom fundraisers for various politicians, both in the Democratic and Republican parties, senators and representatives. And, we were forced into Zoom calls because of the pandemic.
Sure.
And at that time, the Hill was closed, and it's now starting to reopen. But we've found that the Zoom calls are extremely efficient. We can script them out. We have the attention of the representative, and they're on Zoom, so we can see whether they're listening to us or not. And so basically, we can tell that they're paying attention. They've been very effective. What we have done basically is just education of how valuable 1031 is to the economy. Last year we had the Ernst & Young macroeconomic study updated, and it found that basically it was updated with 2021 data. And Ernst & Young found that in 2021 alone, 1031 exchanges generated 976,000 jobs, which creates 48.6 billion with a B of labor income, and it adds 97.4 billion to the U.S. GDP. And all of this economic activity generates tax revenue. Ernst & Young estimated that in 2021 alone, 1031 exchanges generated $13.1 billion in federal, state, and local taxes. 8.2 is at the federal level. And in addition, as you know, when somebody does a 1031 exchange, you have a carryover basis. You do not get a purchase money basis on the replacement property because you're only able to depreciate property one time. And so because of that, the exchanger has slightly less depreciation deduction in the replacement property. Ernst & Young found that generates an additional $6 billion of federal income taxes. So combined, you're looking at over $19 billion in taxes that are generated. The JCT estimated that capping 1031 would generate approximately $3.1 billion in revenue. So on one hand, if you did that, you'd gain $3.1 billion, but you would lose $19.1 billion. So, that has been a very, very, very effective way of educating our representatives that 1031 is not a loophole. It is a very important part of the U.S. economy.
I agree with you completely. By the way, Jim, I don't know if it's a speaker issue. You fade out a little bit. We heard you much better that time, but you did fade in and out a couple of times, but you seem to be back. This is a dumb question maybe, but I'm writing down these numbers about $13.1 billion in 2021 alone, $19 billion in total, but I'm slightly confused because I always thought that the purpose of a 1031 exchange was to defer capital gains taxes. So where are all those taxes coming from?
Well,
if people are deferring taxes? Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. 1031 increases the velocity of the economy. And so because of 1031 exchanges, and obviously after the pandemic, as you know very well, there's a lot of buildings that have to be repurposed. Around the country, there's a lot of old motels and hotels that have been converted into affordable apartments, affordable housing. And there's retail facilities that have been converted. When we're talking about commercial real estate, that is where a lot of the jobs occur, because this generates, when somebody does a 1031 exchange, owners maintain, but buyers improve. And we found and all the studies have pointed out that 1031 buyers do a lot more improvements to properties. And so this generates the jobs and it generates the tax revenue. Basically, you're absolutely correct that the exchanger is deferring taxes, but still, even though the exchanger is deferring taxes, since they're carrying that carrying that depreciation schedule over to the replacement property, they're still have a little bit less depreciation deductions than they would if they had purchased it with cash and had a purchase money basis. So that's the $6 billion.
Okay. All right. Understood. Okay. So, Jim, am I correct in referring to the person who's selling a property and buying another property as the exchanger with an OR at the end?
Yes.
Okay.
Although, whenever I type it, Word tells me I misspelled it.
Yeah, me too. But using that word exchanger for this podcast anyway, to be the person that's selling and buying another property, I'm going to use that term and ask you: does a potential exchanger need to know the basis in the property that they're selling in order to take advantage of a 1031 exchange, or is that not? So I'm talking about a basis. This isn't necessarily the purchase price or the sale price or the purchase price of the next property, but there's a basis which is different than the sale price. Do they need to know that to do an exchange, or is that something better left to like a CPA?
They don't need to know that, but I always say they should know it.
Okay.
Because that's going to be determinative of whether they should do a 1031 exchange. So they really should know their tax basis.
Okay. So sticking with that last comment, that's a great comment. Who should not, I don't know if that's the proper way to ask this question, who should not be considering a 1031 exchange?
Well, that also is a good question. It's people, I have, in my experience, and I've been with IPX for a little over 19 years. In my experience, sometimes people will contact us, set up an exchange, and then they talk to their tax advisor. That's the backwards way of doing it. They should speak to their tax advisor first to find out, should I do an exchange or should I sell this in a taxable sale? And the reason somebody might want to sell it in a taxable sale is sometimes people have carry forward losses. And so if they have carry forward losses, which they could, if they sell it in a taxable sale and wipe out their gain on the tax return, if they wipe out their gain with the carry forward losses, then they could still buy the replacement property, but now they have a purchase money basis in their replacement property, and their depreciation deductions would be higher. So it's a factor, it's a conversation that should take place between the exchanger and their tax advisor prior to setting up an exchange.
Okay, perfect. Understood. Jim, I'm going to pivot just a little bit, but I'm sure this is right in your wheelhouse with my next couple of questions to you. One being the concept of a reverse exchange. How does a reverse exchange work? Who can take advantage of a reverse exchange, and how might it differ maybe from a kind of a standard straight up 1031 exchange?
Yeah, a forward exchange is basically, the concept is you're selling first, you're buying later.
Okay.
In a reverse exchange, you're buying first and selling later, but you cannot be entitled, the exchanger cannot be entitled to both properties at the same time. So it's very helpful to think of a reverse exchange as really just a parking transaction. We are parking one of the properties, either the relinquished property, the old investment property, or the new investment property, and it's being parked with the EAT, which is an abbreviation, an acronym for Exchange Accommodation Title Holder. Usually that's the qualified intermediary having a different hat, having a different role. But basically, the EAT takes legal title to that property. And so that prevents the exchanger from having title in both properties at the same time, which would render doing an exchange impossible. So the process, basically, the most common where is a replacement property parked reverse. So what happens is the exchanger either lends the money, usually they'll lend the money that's equal to the equity they've got in a piece of property, or maybe they borrow it. And the replacement property is acquired and parked. And then they find a buyer for the relinquished property. The dollars go to the qualified intermediary. The qualified intermediary transfers the money to the EAT. The EAT pays off the loan or pays down the loan and then transfers the replacement property to the exchanger. So you still have you always have an exchange, but think about it's sometimes easier to think about a reverse as being a parking transaction. So we're
Okay.
parking one of the properties to prevent them from having title in their hands to both at the same time.
So if I understand you correctly, Jim, and you use the term forward exchange, so I'm going to use that in a forward exchange, the person selling that property will be able to take those proceeds, move those to the accommodator, and use those proceeds to buy the next property. If they're doing a reverse exchange, is it safe to say they have to have that cash somewhere or have the ability to borrow it? So if somebody has a lot of extra money, they're probably a decent candidate for a reverse exchange. But if the seller of a property doesn't have the extra funds or the ability to borrow those funds and they need the funds from the sold property, which hasn't sold yet, they're probably not a candidate for a reverse exchange.
Well, if they accept that a lot of times in a reverse exchange in a replacement property parked reverse, which I just described, there will be two loans. There'll be, the permanent financing, which and also a second loan, which is going to get paid off when the replacement property or relinquished property sells. So let's take that two loan scenario. The replacement property is acquired, and the relinquished property is sold. The dollars go to the QI, then the dollars go to the EAT. The EAT pays off that second loan and then transfers the replacement property subject to the permanent financing.
Okay.
So in effect, we've moved the equity from the relinquished property over to the replacement property in that scenario. So you
Okay.
could do it with, you could do it certainly with extra money from the exchanger who's making the loan, or they could, basically get a second loan in addition to the permanent financing that's going to exist when they take title to the property.
Perfect. Understood. And then, Jim, I'm not really very familiar with the term improvement exchanges, but in advance of this call on this podcast, I did a lot of reading online and so on. Tell us what an improvement exchange is and how that works.
Okay. An improvement exchange, another name for an improvement exchange, is a build-to-suit exchange. And let me give you an example. Let's say that my relinquished property has a net value, a net sales price of $1 million. So if I just set up a regular forward exchange, $1 million is going to go to the QI. And let's say that the replacement property is worth $600,000. So in a regular forward exchange, the qualified intermediary is going to send $600,000 over to the escrow, relating to the replacement property. And the seller of that property is going to transfer the replacement property to the exchanger. And then after the exchange, the balance of the exchange account is going to go to the exchanger, the $400,000, and that's going to be boot. So the question would be, what if I want to take that $400,000 to improve the value of the replacement property before I take title to it? So in that situation, the $600,000 goes to the seller. The seller transfers, we still use the EAT. The seller transfers the replacement property to the EAT. And while the EAT is entitled to the property, work is done on it. So the construction or the exchanger is the construction manager. The work is being done. The exchanger looks at the work and says, that work is fine. Go ahead and pay the invoices out of the exchange account. So our goal is to spend that $400,000 during the 180 days that started clicking when the relinquished property transferred.
Okay, good. Understood. Jim, should a potential, using the term exchanger again, should a potential exchanger be concerned about the financial strength of the accommodator? you're a lot of this conversation is focused on parking money with the accommodator and so on. So how concerned should the seller or exchanger be with giving their money to the accommodator and knowing that it's safe, secure, and so on?
Should be very concerned. They basically any exchanger should do basic due diligence on the qualified intermediary.
You need to get,
sure
I'm sorry, just please a little closer to your speaker because you faded out a little bit.
They should be very
Perfect.
concerned about the security of the qualified intermediary. They want to make sure that they have, that they have security, that they have a fidelity bond. They should have errors and omissions insurance. They should also have a written performance guarantee, and everything should be transparent. If you ask the qualified intermediary, where do you place the funds? They should tell you. There should not be anything behind the curtain. So everything needs to be very transparent. But fortunately, we have not had any defalcations in the 1031 world since, I believe, the last one was in 2010, so quite a few years ago. But nevertheless, it is still very, very important. You have to make sure that the money that you have on deposit with the qualified intermediary is still going to be there when you want to acquire the replacement property.
So I would imagine if it's not there, not only could your money be at risk, but your exchange could be at risk, and your capital gains tax could be, if you're facing $1 million or even a $500,000 capital gains tax, and something happens to the money and you can't complete the transaction, I'd imagine it's a double whammy. You lost your equity, and you also you're going to get slapped by the IRS for that $500,000. That could be devastating.
Yes, because to the IRS, you had a taxable sale. So because you had a taxable sale, you didn't complete your exchange. You had a taxable sale. You owe the taxes.
Okay.
You lost the money. So yes, it is a double win.
All right, and because you brought it up, I just want to ask you to expand on it a little bit. Where should the money be? I don't know if there's such a thing as should, but where should the money be parked? Is it going into a bank account? Is it going, like, you guys are huge, obviously. FNF owns, a bunch of title companies. You guys, I don't know, throwing out numbers, probably have billions of dollars on any given day that you're managing. So is somebody's money going into a bank account? Is it going into your account? How is that money being held typically?
The industry standard is that, yes, it is put in a bank account. And it's very, very important that the exchange funds are not commingled with the qualified intermediaries' operating funds. I can really only speak to IPX, but what we do is we put the money in bank accounts in the individual's social security number or tax ID number, whichever is applicable. But it's on deposit with a bank, a large, very stable bank.
Okay. Jim, I've dealt with a lot of different title companies, including, many of the FNF family of companies. I always hear such things as fees are stated, fees are regulated. I'm talking about fees not for an exchange, mind you. I'm talking about with a title company, title fees, escrow fees, etc. I always hear such things as stated rates and published rates and so on. Flipping that over to a 1031 exchange and an accommodator or an EAT, as you mentioned, EAT, are those fees, charges, rates, etc., are they like the same sorts of fees that title companies are charging? Are they published? Are they regulated? Or are they just, this is what company A charges, this is what company B charges, and so on?
It's the latter. It is not regulated. There is no published rates like in title industries. It varies from area of the country to area of the country. And we talked a little bit about reverse exchanges. Reverse exchanges are significantly more expensive and more complicated than a regular forward exchange. Let's just pick a number, and let's assume that the exchange fee for a forward exchange is, let's say, $1,000. Typically, that will include relinquishing and replacement property, although there might be a small additional property charge. When you're talking about a reverse exchange, you're probably looking at $5,000 or more. Starting at $5,000, so it's significantly more. I generally say that a reverse exchange, you probably want to have at least $20,000 in gain in order to make it pencil out and make it worthwhile. That's why you should check what are the fees, but fees are not just that's not only factor. The capability, the expertise, a lot of things are involved, as well as security. It's just not just fees.
Oh, sure.
So I would caution people from just, shopping the internet and finding the cheapest one, because sometimes you get what you pay for.
You just took the words out of my mouth. I was just about to say, you could, if you're shopping for lower fees, you could get what you pay for, and you could be throwing a lot to the wind to save a few bucks. Of course, if the money's not there when you need it to be there for the next transaction, it doesn't matter if you save 10%, 20%. You should have gone with the other company that's safer and more established. Without asking you for your fees, I would never do that. Is it safe to say that the fees charged for a 1031 exchange are in direct proportion to the amount of equity that you're holding on to? Is it a percentage, or is it in some other way related to how much is being deposited by the exchanger?
No, and most exchange companies, and I can only speak to for ours, but it's a flat fee. And it doesn't matter. The only time that a fee would go up is in terms of the value of the property, would be in a reverse or a build-to-suit exchange, and that's just because the risk involved, because the EAT is entitled, legal title to the property during the construction. So there are risks, I don't need to tell anybody on this call that there are risks to owning property. And just because you're an EAT or you're qualified intermediary, taking title to the piece of property is no different. And so the more valuable the property, the greater the risk.
Sure.
So there's some there, but generally in a forward exchange, it's just a flat fee.
Okay, understood. We are coming to the end of our time together, Jim, but I do have one more question for you. I don't know if this falls in your wheelhouse or your area of expertise, but I'm sure you've heard of DSTs, Delaware Statutory Trusts. Those are not exchanges, right? And those aren't tax deferred. Can you comment a little bit about DSTs, what they are, how they work, and how they might differ from a 1031 exchange?
Basically, a Delaware Statutory Trust, and there is some guidance from the IRS, came out in 2004. As long as the Delaware Statutory Trust is structured in a way that they've given their blessing to, it's considered real property for tax purposes. So as far as a 1031 exchange goes, it's just another piece of real estate. It's just like owning a strip center, 100% of the strip center. It's just you would just own a fractional portion of the trust. So it is eligible. I mean, it's not an exchange per se. Think about Delaware Statutory Trust that is the property. So that's a property that's eligible for as a relinquished property in a 1031 exchange, and it's also eligible as replacement property in a 1031 exchange.
Okay, which means you can, if you're part of a DST, you could exchange out of that either into another Delaware Statutory Trust or a standalone. I'm going to just call it a standalone, where you exit the DST and buy your own property.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
A lot of times we've had a lot of situations particularly in farming areas in the country, where you might have an old aging baby boomer farmer who wants to retire. And a lot of times 85, 90, maybe 90, maybe even 95% of their net worth is tied up in the land that they own. And so if they were to sell it, they would send a big chunk of their equity away in the form of taxes, which wouldn't be there to support them in their retirement years. But they want to get out of farming. So a lot of times they will sell the farm and then reinvest, do a 1031 exchange into Delaware statutory trust type of property, which is really just mailbox management. It's professionally managed, and they send the money, wire the money into your account.
Okay. Well, Jim, thank you very much. We have come to the end of our time together today. I did want to ask you, though, I've got some notes here regarding the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, the Ernst & Young macroeconomic study, and so on. If any of our listeners, this is kind of a twofold question. If any of our listeners want to do some more research, homework, et cetera, look into this a little bit more with regard to 1031 exchange, is there a single source anywhere online that they can look at, or maybe more than one source?
There's a website that the Federation of Exchange Accommodators operates. It's called 1031 Builds America. And there are copies of there's copies of white papers on there. There's also copies of the studies of the Ernst & Young study, which is a macroeconomic study. There's also a microeconomic study that was done by two professors, Professors Ling and Petrova, and copies of that are also on there. And certainly, if anybody wants, if they want to send me an email, james.miller@ipx1031.com, I'll be happy to provide them with any information that I have.
And that was going to be my next question. So James, JAMES.Miller, MILLER, at ipx1031.com, and they can send an email to you. And going back to the site for the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, that's 1031 Built, B-U-I-L-T, as in Tom?
Builds, B-U-I-L-D-S.
Oh, Builds. Okay. Yeah. So 1031
buildsamerica.org.
Buildsamerica.org. I'm going to say that one more time. 1031 Builds, B-U-I-L-D-S, America.org. And that's probably got a wealth of information that people can read up on. Well, great. Well, as I said at the beginning of the call, Jim, I always tell people you forgot more than most people know about 1031 exchanges. It's probably more than anybody knows about 1031 exchanges. Thanks for joining us today. Again, you've been listening to the Savvy Commercial Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Neil Sherman. My guest today has been Jim Miller with IPX 1031 Exchange. Jim, thank you very much. We hope you'll come back again sometime and speak to the group.
Thanks, Neil. I'd be happy to.
Take care and have a great weekend.
Take care.
All right, bye-bye.